Have you ever found an old photo of yourself and immediately wanted to hide it? Not because anything terrible was happening, you were just being yourself, or at least the version of yourself you were back then. Maybe it was the haircut, maybe it was the caption, maybe it was the way you talked, the way you dressed, the things you thought were cool. And suddenly you feel it, that uncomfortable reaction, that urge to look away, that feeling we call cringe. It's strange because the person in that photo is you, but somehow it doesn't feel like you anymore. So why does this happen? Why do we cringe at our past self? And why can old versions of us feel almost like strangers? The answer starts with a simple fact. You changed. Most of the time, we don't notice ourselves changing. It happens slowly. A conversation here, a mistake there, a new experience, a new perspective, year after year. Then one day, you find evidence of who you used to be. An old photo, an old message, an old memory, and suddenly you're face to face with a version of yourself that no longer exists. That's where the cringe begins. Because cringe is really a comparison. You're comparing who you were to who you are now. If an old memory still feels like you, there's usually no problem. The discomfort appears when your brain says, that's not me anymore. Maybe you were trying too hard to fit in. Maybe you copied people around you. Maybe you desperately wanted approval. Maybe you thought you had everything figured out. At the time, it probably made sense. That's the part we forget. Your past self wasn't trying to be embarrassing. They were trying to belong, trying to be accepted, trying to figure out who they were, just like everyone else. A lot of what we call cringe is actually experimentation. People try different personalities, different styles, different beliefs, different ways of being seen. Some stay, some disappear, and years later, the abandoned versions come back to haunt us. But here's something interesting. Cringing at your past self can actually be a sign of growth because it means you can see the difference. You have more awareness now, more experience, more perspective. The person looking back is not the same person who lived through that moment. And that's exactly why it feels uncomfortable. Not because the old version was terrible, but because you've outgrown them. The cringe is evidence that something changed. And then there's another reason these memories hurt. Your brain remembers them differently than everyone else does. You remember them from the inside. You remember how awkward you felt, how exposed you felt, how intensely you experienced the moment. Everyone else saw it from the outside, and most of them barely noticed. Psychologists call this the spotlight effect. We tend to believe people pay far more attention to us than they actually do. You remember the awkward joke, the weird haircut, the embarrassing post, the awkward phase, but most people were busy thinking about themselves, their mistakes, their insecurities, their embarrassing moments. That's the strange part. You are haunted by memories that other people probably forgot years ago. Interestingly, not everyone experiences cringe in the same way. Some people barely think about their past mistake. Others replay them for years. Why? Part of the answer is self-awareness. The more you reflect on yourself, the more likely you are to compare who you are today with who you used to be. That can be uncomfortable, but it can also be useful because self-awareness is often what allows people to grow in the first place. The same ability that makes you cringe, it is often the ability that helps you improve. In other words, the people who cringe the most aren't always the people who made the biggest mistakes. Sometimes they're simply the people paying the closest attention to themselves. And today, that feeling can become even stronger because the internet doesn't forget as easily as people do. Old posts remain online, old photos survive, old videos stay archived somewhere. Sometimes a forgotten version of yourself can suddenly reappear with a single click, and that's uncomfortable. Not because the old version was bad, but because you've moved beyond them. The problem is that many people respond to this feeling in the wrong way. They become afraid of being cringe. They stop trying new things. They stop expressing themselves. They stop taking creative risks because they're afraid future versions of themselves will look back and laugh. But almost everything meaningful starts with an awkward version of yourself. Nobody begins as the finished product. Confidence has an awkward stage. Creativity has an awkward stage. Friendships have awkward stages. Success has awkward stages. Growth almost always looks embarrassing while it's happening. The people you admire today once had their own cringe moments. Like, you just don't see them anymore, which brings us to something important. Not every cringe memory is a sign that something went wrong. Sometimes it's simply proof that something changed, that you learned, that you matured, that you became more self-aware. There's also something a little unfair about the way we judge our past selves. We often expect the old version of us to know everything we know today, but that's impossible. The person you were 5 years ago had less experience, less knowledge, less perspective, yet somehow we judge them using standards they never had access to. It's like reading the first chapter of a book. and getting angry that the character hasn't reached the ending yet. Of course they hadn't. They were still becoming the person they would eventually be, and so were you. The next time you cringe at an old photo or memory, pause for a moment. Instead of judging that version of yourself, try to understand them. They didn't know what you know now. They hadn't lived what you've lived. They hadn't become you yet, and maybe that's the whole point. You're not supposed to relate perfectly to every version of yourself. If you did, it might mean you never changed at all. The old photo feels strange because you've moved forward. The old memory feels uncomfortable because you've grown. The old version feels unfamiliar because they're no longer the person you are. So yes, they may have been awkward, they may have been dramatic, they may have been embarrassing, but they were also necessary. They were the rough draft, the unfinished version, the person who had to exist. So you could become this one. The cringe was never the problem. It was simply the feeling of growth when you finally looked back.